Greetings and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News. I am Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, which publishes chalkboardnews.com. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K-12 education. Joining me today is Chalkboard's K-12 editor, Brendan Clary. How are you, Brendan?
I'm doing well, Dan. How about yourself?
I am great, thank you. We are recording this on Monday, September 25th. Brendan, we write a lot at chalkboardnews.com about various issues and concepts surrounding K-12 schools. One, I think it's a relatively new concept that you wrote about, has to do with hybrid homeschooling, which I admittedly was not all that familiar with until I read your report. Tell our listeners what hybrid homeschooling is, and how does school choice initiatives across the country come into play?
Yeah, and I have to admit, I was not super familiar with it myself. I think that that's pretty understandable in terms of, it is sort of like a burgeoning thing, I think, or just, it's an interesting sort of thing, especially after COVID when people are talking a lot about choice. There's a lot of different kind of school choice initiatives or smaller, different education models, essentially. So hybrid homeschooling is sort of a mix, right, of traditional schooling and homeschooling. So that's what Michael McShane told me. He wrote the book on hybrid homeschooling, and he offered a lot of good insights. Essentially, he said, for the purposes of his book, there's a couple of days in class, a couple of days in the home. And he said, essentially, if you're a younger student, you're more likely to spend maybe just one day outside the home, and most of your days would be learning in the home. And then as you get older, that might switch. And so you're spending a lot more time, in these different sort of outside educational opportunities, and then, maybe one day at home. So the number of days away often, increases as students get older. So it's not new. That's an interesting thing. I think there's maybe more of a resurgence now after COVID, but it started back in the 1990s in Texas and Colorado. There was some specific sort of hotspots for hybrid homeschooling where people came together and said, this is something that we're really interested in. But really what precipitated reporting on it is ExcelinEd, a group. They released a report about hybrid homeschooling and sort of the intersection of hybrid homeschooling and school choice, which is a very interesting question to ask. If you have, education savings accounts that are open for parents, families to use if their kids are homeschooled, does that still apply if there's some traditional schooling involved in that? And then, do they have basically a way to report the hybrid aspect of your education? So that's the conundrum that the report is looking at, is how do states conceptualize hybrid homeschooling? Do they have a space to categorize hybrid homeschooling? So that's sort of the question is, if you mark private school, it'll say, private school or homeschool. And this is sort of in between. And there's also an interesting thing about hybrid homeschooling is that a lot of public schools, or some public schools at least, have, a part-time enrollment option, which means, if you're homeschooled, you can attend electives at a public high school or a public school. And so, maybe you could be a homeschool student who does band and choir at the local high school. So, or art classes or something like that, where maybe it's not like a core class, but you're able to take advantage of, a more specialized teaching perhaps, or a specialized program. So it is a really interesting, sort of regulatory question of how do you help families? And there are a number of states that have, these expanded education savings account or ESA programs for families that allow them to take public taxpayer money and use it toward private or any educational expenses, right? And so the question is, and how do you sort of open up those programs to hybrid homeschooling to allow families who are hybrid homeschooling or interested in hybrid homeschooling to access those funds in a way that helps them be able to do sort of like, the in-between of pulling a little bit here, pulling a little bit there. And so that's what I heard from the people I talked to about this, like Ben DeGrow from ExcelinEd or Michael McShane from EdChoice, that these states can make it easier for families who are looking to use hybrid homeschooling to have different kinds of standards. So instead of seat time, to have competency-based standards, which I thought was very interesting. And, to have laws that allow for these sorts of programs. That's sort of like a good first step to get these programs going, if that makes sense. So I've been talking a long time. I'm happy to answer any questions that you had.
Yeah, and as I said, too, it's somewhat new to me. So I imagine in these hybrid homeschool models, parents work in conjunction with teachers and school administrators? Because if a child, let's just say it's 1 day a week, child goes to the classroom, a traditional public school 1 day a week, and their mother or their father runs their homeschooling, 4 days a week, you would think from a curriculum standpoint, at least for the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, science, those kinds of things, that there's some sort of gelling between the parents and the school district, so they're all on the same page. So the school's not teaching one thing, and the mom or the dad or whoever the homeschool teacher is teaching something else.
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely, the appeal is that you could sort of tailor the amount of instruction time and the kind of instruction time with sort of homeschooling curriculum that you want, and so you would definitely have to be on the same page there. And I think that's sort of how these things got started is, people with, like-minded families who are very interested in homeschooling, but, maybe are not super into teaching math. And so it's, how do we sort of specialize and instruct our students in these specific areas, while still being homeschooled. And that's one of the things that Michael McShane was telling me about, is that the flexibility of it, allowing students to be at home most of the time or have limited instruction time outside the home is super important to a lot of families who, maybe they want their students' academic life to kind of reflect their own. Maybe they're able to work from home during COVID, and that's important to them to sort of have that rhythm, not be the traditional public school sort of rhythm. So it is that I think that's all a consideration and a factor there, right? Of making sure that you're on board with this, but this might better reflect what a family wants for their students. And so Michael McShane, he said the ESAs are almost perfectly tailored to hybrid homeschooling. So, he kind of contrasted those with vouchers that are, you will pay this to private school tuition, right? Like, we'll give you the money, but it goes directly to them, or it goes directly to them, sort of thing. So with this, there's a lot of room for that non-traditional approach. If the money covers everything for the curriculum, then you can use, or for the tuition, then you can use that to maybe fund something that's specific to, the students' interests, right? And so that was something that they cited as like, this is a cheaper way of kind of, you have that home instruction, you have that, outside instruction, and this is sort of like a cheaper, third option essentially for families.
As you reported in this story, Brendan, not all states have ESA or education savings account programs. In fact, only 15 do, and not all 15 of those states have accommodations for this hybrid homeschooling. So, one, I'm fascinated by the idea, fascinated by the conversation. I think it's maybe something that as legislatures get back into session next year, as we've talked about here at Education in Focus, and we write frequently at chalkboardnews.com, school choice options and opportunities is a big topic in state legislatures across the country. So maybe this is something many legislatures get back in session January, February, etc., early next year. Something to consider. But, Brendan, that's all the time we have. Listeners can keep up with this story and all stories related to K-12 education at chalkboardnews.com. For Brendan Clary, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.